Good morning, folks. So, today is going to be a little different. For one of my classes, I've started reading Roudolph Steiner. And Rudolph Steiner is a very enigmatic character. He is a philosopher, a mystic, an educator, a biodynamic agricultural innovator. He's really, really difficult to nail down into any one thing because he did so many things. And most people don't know much about him. If you've heard his name, you're probably in the 10%, 5% of humans that know who he is. He's not well known. And the reason he's not well known, I would imagine, he founded the Waldorf schools. He's not well known mainly because he was also a teacher of Western esotericism, which is very trippy stuff. It's fascinating. It's actually what I've been thinking about more than Steiner himself and his work, because I've barely scratched the surface. I've really had to stop and really step back and ask myself, what is esoteric? If Steiner did all this kind of, practical, exoteric, useful things, yet he still doesn't have a place in mainstream culture because of his esoteric teachings. Why is that? And what is it about esotericism that is, rejected by, the mainstream worldview or by the dominant kind of paradigm or whatnot? It's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so let me step back. I reflect back onto Kant's critique of pure reason, Immanuel Kant, and his conception of how mind and reality work. Just because I've read that fairly recently, so that seems to be a reasonable reference point for me. And I'm thinking about how we know things about the world and how we acquire knowledge about things. At least according to Kant, there are basically, and others, there are basically two ways that we can have, experience, gain knowledge, right? There are sense perceptions, eyes, nose, mouth, ears, touch, sense perceptions. And then there are kind of like mental constructions, there are thought patterns. Interpretations. The mind itself can create ideas that we haven't experienced before. And so these two different ways of knowing the world are kind of what's acceptable in modern society. But even then, there are limits. We're our imagination, right? Our thoughts about the world are not inherently true. I can picture things that don't exist and maybe couldn't. And so, we have a genre called fiction, which indicates that it didn't happen and it's not true. And that's all just out of our minds. This is not esoteric. This is just imagination. This is creativity and artistic, expression of sorts. But esotericism is something different. It's almost like a third way of knowing. Which is the third way, which is somehow inexplicable, which is basically what is found to be unacceptable to the mainstream culture, is the fact that you can't explain it well. You can't. It doesn't translate well into words. It's like mystical experiences. Like if we look within religious traditions and you have mystics, what's going on there? Well, they're having an experience. They're not just reading it in a book and talking about it and having some intellectual ideas about what's going on. They're actually having an experience. And then they're trying to translate that back into words and communicate it to people. So that's kind of an esoteric experience. But Steiner is kind of an esoteric outside of a particular tradition. He definitely has a lot of Christian, influence to his work. But it would be a real stretch to call him a Christian in the traditional sense. He's has some different ideas. He sees a lot of. It's not even fair to call him Christian exactly, because he also discusses Krishna and Buddha and all kinds of stuff. He's extraordinarily well educated. Sorry, folks, that cut off in the middle. I'm gonna have to splice these together. Very well educated. I think he got a degree in philosophy. He did his dissertation. I can't remember, but it was on a philosophical subject. And he's somebody that has experiences that are outside of what is considered normal, acceptable, whatever. And so it's very interesting to reflect on this because what is esoteric? What's this third way of knowing? What is this? What is it? It's like intuition. Is it some kind of like a holographic type manifestation of our nature as both an individual and a part of the whole? Like, are we able to somehow, like through like a Jungian type of unconscious of sorts, connect to some higher levels of reality than we can experience on the everyday basis because our part of our nature is to exist as a part of a larger whole? I mean, it's really hard to say. I definitely don't have the answer. But what I'm finding is that contemplating it is pretty fascinating. It's like a third way. It's like that, it's a knowing, but not a knowing associated with any particular means. So because of that, it's like, it's impossible to verify, right? Well, I don't know if it's impossible. It's very difficult to verify, esoteric knowledge, if not impossible. I don't pretend to be anything close to an expert on this. I'm just thinking about it. Like normal knowledge, I would have this idea, and I would then explain to you why I thought this, and we could say, that's reasonable. That makes sense. That logically that makes sense. I understand why you might come to that conclusion. Or if we're talking about something out in the world, I can give you an example of what I'm talking about. I'm like, look at this thing over here. Do you see that too? Oh, yes. Now we both see it, and therefore we agree that it exists, and we can show other people. But with esoteric knowledge, if an individual has some kind of, I guess what we call it, like some kind of special way of knowing things, I mean, this gets in pretty tricky territory, because then you get into the whole guru trap of like, the authority of knowledge. Like, you're just gonna have to trust me that I had this experience and I know these things. Just trust me here. I definitely know what I'm talking about. And that's totally antithetical to the modern Western worldview. Which is like, where you have Voltaire saying like, dare to know. Be a critical thinker. Think for yourself. Don't just accept what you're told. This, which we all, generally, respect. We like people who think for themselves and are critical thinkers and ask good questions and are curious, and and then you have this other tradition, which is hey, I had this experience, and I can tell you about it if you want to know about it. It's a personal experience that I've had, and I've seen things which are unusual that I haven't talked much about, but they're very meaningful, and I'd like to share them with you. That's kind of like an esoteric thing. And so it's not exactly simply subjective, because to say something subjective, I mean, esoteric experiences are subjective, but they're not just subjective. Like, I can say I read a book and I had some thoughts about this book, just like I'm having here. I had some thoughts about something that I read, or a movie that I saw, or a conversation, or I'm imagining this sequence of events, or this thing may be happening, right? I can do all that. That's not esoteric. That's just subjective. That's just me having thoughts. So when we refer to esoteric, we're talking about something different. We're talking about something that goes beyond just my individual mental capacities, definitely beyond my sensory capacities, and encountering and experiencing the world in a different kind of way. And that's very challenging for the critical modern mind. I'll admit it's very challenging for me to read this stuff sometimes. I'm just like, oh, come on. How the heck am I supposed to, blah, blah, It's just this part that comes out. I'm like, give me a break. This is too much. And blah, I have all these thoughts that come up, But at the same time, I'm reading it and I'm like, what if I was in his shoes and I had some kind of experience that that just didn't fit with anyone. How would I explain that? And I would probably sound just as crazy as he was. He sounds sometimes when he's talking about these things, but I don't. What would you do? So I have an understanding of it there as well, because I've had some experiences in my life that are difficult to explain, which I won't go into here, but they are they're just there. I just look at them as unique experiences that I've had, and I don't try and share them with people because they're just my own experiences. Steiner and other, I suppose, esoteric mystic folks are trying to share these experiences, which I can only imagine how challenging that is. But it's a very interesting distinction. It's a very interesting, a very interesting way of thinking about what esotericism is. It's like the third way. So anyway, these are just some random thoughts I've been having as I'm encountering it. I'm noticing my own lean towards empiricism and needing verifiable. It's very hard for me to just kind of let go and read this and be like, oh yeah, totally, there's spiritual beings around that I can't see. I have a very hard time with that. Just engaging with it. I'm just an agnostic about these things, generally speaking. I'm not like a hard line against it, or I don't feel comfortable being for it, but I'm generally have an agnostic attitude, being like, yeah, I haven't experienced it. Maybe you did, but I haven't. So I can only say that I know that you experienced it. I can't say that it's real. I haven't had that experience. So it makes me encounter my own predispositions in that direction. Things that I wasn't aware were so strong within me. I'm not sure if I want to change them or not. It's interesting to encounter them. Like, I think they are a safety mechanism that has a valid role. They're kind of like, your BS detectors, when somebody's trying to just kind of feed you a line of whatever for their own nefarious ends or something, and they want to control you or influence you. This is the kind of attitude you should have, is be skeptical and be like, I don't know about that. But then again, if you do that indiscriminately, you may also be cutting yourself off from perhaps some less explored, legitimate experiences of life that maybe are very meaningful. So it's an interesting thing to think about, and it's something that I'm just kind of like toying with in my mind and contemplating. So anyways, thanks for listening, and have a fantastic day. I'll continue to post some stuff as I read more on the subject. It's very interesting. It's challenging and thought-provoking. So, and for that I'm grateful. All right, talk to you soon.